Second contribution to the second panel, Secunda Secunda. Gretchen Reydams-Schils, her paper title is Calcidius on Matter of Minimal Dualism. Gretchen is, of course, professor in the program of liberal studies at the University of Notre Dame, and is concurrent professor of classics, philosophy, and theology there as well. And as I'm sure most of you know, she is the author of, among many other things, Demiurge and Providence, Stoic and Platonist Readings of Plato's Timaeus, 1999, The Roman Stoics, Self, Responsibility, and Affection, 2005, and most recently, and most relevantly to today's topic, Calcidius on Plato's Timaeus, Greek Philosophy, Latin Reception, and Christian Contexts. Please join me in welcoming Gretchen.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be part of this initiative, for which I really want to thank Nicola. Nicola has found a way to hopefully share the long Latin passage, and I will go into share screen mode, into share screen mode, so that you'll be able to follow the structure, hopefully, of my talk.
Gretchen, before you start, the link asks for a request of access on your part, I think, so to access the Google. Yeah, sorry.
And I don't know how to do that. Okay, hold on. Yeah, so now I'm getting LD requests for access.
Can you say what the passage is?
All right. Yeah, it's basically, okay, I'm just going to quickly go through the messages so that for those of you, it's chapters 300 and 301, and it's long, so I didn't want to put it on the handout because it would have distracted us from the structure of my talk. I'm trying to share it now. This is going to take some time if I have to go through every email. This is probably not a good use of our time. So I think I'll just go ahead. And for those of you who are interested, you can call up the text, but it is chapters 300 and 301. Okay, I'm going to do a new share. Okay, so you now should all see the structure, the outline of my talk. And I think that for those of you who are in medieval philosophy, what I will end up saying on Calcidius might be quite different from the received view or the way he traveled to the history of his reception. And that in itself would be a very interesting discussion. Because of course, what happened in the later tradition is that the text was often excerpted. And so it really depends on how you use, even in modern scholarship, certain parts of the commentary. As Anna has already pointed out, the treatise on matter is really the longest sub-treatise in the commentary. It's about a third of the commentary. And I've briefly given you the structure so that we can orient ourselves a little bit. So as is his common methodology, he starts with a preliminary explanation of what he considers to be Plato's views. And that section is usually very important because it sort of governs everything else that follows after it. Then we get a very long doxographical section, which we also have Aristotle, Stoics, and Arminius, among others. And then, and these are the chapters that I've chosen for you, at the end of the doxographical section, and it's a transition towards the more detailed line-by-line exposition, we get a summary of a range of views, let's call them of Plato's students, but I will return to that issue in a minute. And I think this has misled people into believing that these were actually the views that Calcidius himself, at least some of them, that Calcidius himself endorses, whereas I think the situation is quite a bit more complex. So I'm going to take us through the close reading of those two chapters, not even all of them, it would take us too far, and then draw some larger considerations from that analysis. So he says, right at the beginning of the chapter 300, it remains for us to treat of Plato's own opinion concerning matter. So that tells us that we're moving away from the doxographical section, which Plato's students evidently interpret in different ways. Now, the phrase here is auditoris, and there is some leeway in how we want to interpret that. I think maybe it could just be Plato's readers, Plato's interpreters, the people who had access to Plato, or it could be more narrowly conceived as people that see themselves as part of the Platonist tradition. I am using John McGee's translation, by the way, if you haven't seen this, big book, which, I carry with me wherever I go still. So then we start with a string of options. So the first group, for some, fixing on certain phrases rather than the substance of what he says, have thought that it is said by him, the world, matter by him, sorry, it's not the world, it's matter, that it is said by him to be generated. Now, we don't need a lot of background here to realize that we are talking about the famous discussion in the Timaeus, both of the world and the status of the principles. Generated, this is really important for correct understanding. Generated is not limited to Calcidius' commentary to a temporal sense. Here, in fact, with the views that he's discussing here, he's really having the view of a causal dependence on divine causality in mind, rather than matter as an independent principle, right? So even if there isn't a moment in time, however we want to define it, what he rejects in this view is that matter still somehow depends on a divine principle. That's the view of the Hebrews, that he attributes to the Hebrews, which he rejects. It's also, in the Numenius section, a view that he attributes to some Pythagoreans, and you may have had somebody like Reydams-Schils, who somehow had the dyad derived from the monad. But of course, there is another type of generation involved, and this time it's more of a temporal one, however we want to define it. We have a before, namely matter in a disorderly state, and we have an after, an order imposed by the demiurge. When Calcidius discusses Plato's own text, he simply calls this a thought experiment, right? I mean, Plato uses before and after language to try to distinguish those different states. He doesn't have that caution when he discusses Numenius and another group of Pythagoreans. But that view of a transition from this order to order, which entails a kind of before and after, is rejected by Calcidius. For him, the world is eternal. And I've given you here some of the key passages in which he lays out his views. So the first position is, some have thought that matter is generated. The second position is, others have thought that it is ungenerated, but endowed with soul. This is in fact Calcidius' position. So what we find in Calcidius is a dualism of two independent principles. So we have the divine side of reality on the one hand, and we have matter as an eternally coexisting independent principle. And he posits a primordial cosmic soul that is more basic, more primary than the world soul. So it's ungenerated as eternally coexisting, and it is endowed with soul. But there are different ways in which one can interpret this primordial soul. So what follows, and the latter, now a third position, on the strength of this claim, that even prior to its illumination, matter was in a state of flux, its movement being unstable and disorderly, for movement is an intrinsic and innate property of living things. And by the way, that's the section in the Timaeus on the receptacle right at the end, where the receptacle is in some kind of, is compared to some kind of winnowing basket. Also, on strength of his repeated claim in other works that there are two world souls, a malign one originating in matter and a beneficent one originating in God, and that given therefore that good and evil things exist, good ones accrue to the world owing to the beneficent soul, whereas harmful ones do so owing to the material or malign soul. Now we can tell that this is in essence a summary of the view Retrobit's Dunomenius, everything that I've read to you so far. And that although the divine wisdom and intelligence of the craftsman God sternly and effectively persuaded matter to submit passively to its ordering and adornment, the passivity pertains only to living beings that partake of life. All right, so all these little arrows tell us that I want to discuss Calcidius' own position. So Calcidius accepts that matter considered in itself, that is independently from divine causality, is in disorderly flux. That much he accepts because it's part, the winnowing basket imagery is in attendance itself. But he emphatically rejects that evil in the world is caused by an evil world soul, first of all, evil world soul, and secondly, that is intrinsic to matter. Now, mind you, this leaves the relationship between the evil soul and matter unexplained, but it is an intrinsic relationship, the way Calcidius renders it. Instead, what he ends up saying, and but this is right almost at the end of the commentary as we have it, the primordial motion in matter is caused by the traces of the elements, which is actually a term that comes from Plato's Greek. So up to that point, he's been talking about bodies and full-fledged elements, and in chapter 354, he makes that crucial shift to talk about the traces, the ipne, which he considers mere potentialities. And the way he explains it, it becomes some kind of feedback loop, right? So it's the traces that cause motion in matter. Now, again, Anna, you may want to ask, how can traces do that, right? It's a similar issue that you raised. If they're that minimal, how can they even bring about motion? But then the receptacle is in motion and reinforces the motion of the element of those traces of the elements. So in a way, the motion increases. What is really important, and I think Deuze was right here and not Phillips, that for Calcidius, his lower soul, the primordial soul, and for those of you who want to know the background, this of course goes back to a debate on Book 10 of Plato's Laws. I'm not going to dwell on those details here, but there is quite a bit of discussion of what Plato meant there in the tradition. But at any rate, for Calcidius, the lower soul is merely a life force, right? It's lower in the sense that it's kind of brute life without intelligence, but it's not evil as such or the cause of evil in the universe. And we can tell this is the case because in chapter 31, now, if you stop for a minute and think about this, I've just used some of the last chapters in the commentary, and I'm now going all the way back to the beginning of the commentary, which methodologically speaking tells us that there is continuity in the line that Calcidius develops. And that line shows up most of the time in his summary passages, not surprisingly, but it is really there. And it is remarkably consistent. It's not perfectly consistent, but it is remarkably consistent. So right early on in the commentary, Calcidius posits as primordial, meaning these are the building blocks of the elements that existed. So it's not just matter that existed independently of God. We also have this vis anime, and that's the lower soul for him, as well as the vis corporis. And I think what he means by the vis corporis in 31 gets explained right at the end of the commentary as the traces of the elements. So vis is power, but if you think of dynamis in Greek, we might also find eventually our way back to potentiality. So there's quite a bit, there are very thick connotations here, which Calcidius does not necessarily unpack. So what this then leaves us with, I think, is what I have called a minimal ontological dualism. Now, ontological is an old-fashioned term, but I still use it in the simple sense of the structure of reality, right? That's what I use it for. So there is a minimal dualism in the structure of reality. We have matter on the one hand. We have a string of three gods, but that are actually interrelated. And one of them is the world soul, actually, but that's the Calcidius issue of divine as a whole. Is a whole other issue. We have the vis anime, we have the vis corporis, But none of these is in itself evil, which is very striking. Now, there are passages in the commentary, which a number of you might be familiar with. There are moments where, for example, when he talks about the demons, where he suggests sort of along the lines of the Phaedo, that bodies and corporeality can pose a problem. But of course, full-fledged bodies for Calcidius are derivative, they're not primary. So at the level of the original components, as I read the text, there is no real evil factor. And it's definitely not the strong dualism that Calcidius attributes to Numenius. And also, I think if you read sort of through Calcidius' text, he also would not accept that the passivity of living beings would apply to humans, right? I mean, in fact, if anything, we are real agents, or that's what Calcidius wants to maintain. I'm actually leaving out the view of the Hebrews, so it's only two chapters, and I can't even discuss this component of it. But I have argued in my book, for those who are interested, that his presentation of the Hebrews is very much through the lens of Numenius, and that I think is helpful to try to place when he's doing that. But as they say in American lingo, we won't go there today. All right, now we switch to a different group. And of course, as is typical, as most of you know, in these kind of doxographical structures, the connections aren't always spelled out. So there may be overlap between these groups, but that we can tell based on the structure. So we get another group at the beginning of chapter 201. Nor are those lacking who hold that Plato remarked earlier upon the disorderly and tumultuous motion as being not in matter, but in the material elements and bodies which are considered the first principles and elements of the world. This again has to do, this is a rendering that refers back to that final section on the receptacle. Now, a lot of hay has been made that this would be similar to a position attributed to Porphyry, preserved in Philoponus. But what most people, what people who have discussed this before haven't noticed is how Calcidius departs fundamentally, really fundamentally, from Porphyry's position. Why? Well, first, he rejects the notion that the elements, namely full-fledged bodies, right? I mean, fire, air, earth, and water for him are already full-fledged bodies, could be considered principles, right? I mean, they're already derivative. They're already on a second level of reality, beyond the traces and beyond matter. And the other key difference is, in fact, I mean, this is in the chapter. Sorry, I didn't give you the references, but it's in. I have the references in the book, in my book. Porphyry actually rejects the view that the instability that is at issue here in Plato's account would be created merely by matter and traces. So, according to Porphyry, the instability actually requires the full-fledged elements, even if they're in a state before the intervention of the demiurge. Now, what exactly Porphyry meant by that is, quite challenging because, of course, we only have the fragments, but that's what they seem to say. And then the last bit of the chapter, well, again, I have to leave out a bit at the end. For if matter is without form or order, and by the way, Anna, as I read Calcidius, he has both the Aristotelian notion of forms in matter and the Platonic notion of transcendent forms. And he's not the only one. There are other readers in antiquity who have those notions. But if matter is without form or order, then it is surely by its nature motionless as well. And not only motionless, but unchanging, for change will affect not matter, but the bodies in which qualities inhere, and by the same reasoning, also inanimate in virtue of its being motionless. And this is in fact accepted by Calcidius, right? Matter is by its nature motionless. The disorderly motion in matter does not come from an intrinsic lower soul. It's an alienus pulsus. It comes from something from the outside, which are the traces of the elements. And then he just has a bit of a negative description, you know, matter is defined by absence of features via the privativum prefix. It's the carentia, privation, by the way, the Aristotelian notion of privation plays a crucial role in his final assessment towards the end of the treatise. So let me summarize and draw some larger implications, and you know what I call the bigger picture here. So again, as I said, for Calcidius, matter as one of the independent principles is neutral, so it's not evil, or it's even oriented towards the good. There are passages in the commentary where he says that there is even a providence associated with, specifically with matter. And he uses Aristotle Physics 1.9, for which he actually provides a translation in the commentary. That's chapter 286. The disorderly motion is caused by something coming from the outside, namely the traces of the elements. Those, however, are mere potentialities, and I associate this with the vis corporum earlier on in the commentary. And he also posits, sorry, that's the typo, he also posits a basic primordial soul, which is a life principle and in itself not evil, and that's the vis anima. So it is a dualism insofar as matter eternally coexists with divine agency and independently of it. But it's minimal. There is, you know, the notion of evil or deficiency at the level of the structure of reality has really been argued away. I think I have 5 minutes left. Is that correct? Just checking. So I'm wrapping up. If you're looking at the bigger...
Very good time, very good time.
So if you're looking at the bigger picture elements, as I already said also in my response to Anna, the sub-treatise on matter presents an agreement between Pythagoreans, Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics on the notion of an eternally existing prime matter. So again, I think one of the reasons that he ends up with the prime matter is that he also brings in the Stoic notion of matter. And I want to briefly read you that the influence of Stoicism tends to get swept under the table, but this is a chapter from the first laying out of Plato's views, right? The earliest section of the treatise on matter, which is quite systematic. And there he says, providence is the operative agent, while matter is passive and offers itself without resistance for adornment, since the divine mind penetrates and informs it completely and in every quarter, not like the arts which provide form only superficially, but in the way that nature and soul vivify all solid bodies by permeating them. To be sure, there are elements here of active and passive that we find in Plato himself, but if you combine, and it's not a long passage, we have providence, we have the active principle, the passive principle. The fact that the passive principle is completely minimal, offers no resistance whatsoever to the forming operation of this divine mind, and it's complete through and through, right? So much so that Calcidius has to be careful later on in the commentary that, you know, to avoid his divine principle getting too entangled with the material world, because if you look at this language, you know, this could be a kind of complete presence of the divine principle in physical reality. Now, given all those positions that I've read to you, and I've sort of pointed out what Calcidius accepts, where he pursues a different line of inquiry, we really can tell that he exerts, I think, a strong independence vis-a-vis the tradition, Platonist and other. And he says as much, right? And it's not a rhetorical giveaway. For example, the next chapter after the one that I've just read with you starts, chapter 302. We, however, will pursue from among these the view which we consider the stronger, the one better poised for the test of truth, and the one worthy of the wisdom of so great an author, which is Plato. But what happens here, he does not simply pick a view, which is, of course, what people who want to go for a primary source really want him to do, right? I mean, he picks Porphyry position, and then we can pin the entire commentary, as a source on Porphyry. He doesn't simply pick one view, he carefully weighs and combines features of a number of views. And he'd establish a direct line from himself as a commentator to Plato, and Plato becomes also, the highest authority when it comes to matters of truth. Now, the last point that I would like to raise is what we have here, I think, in Calcidius, is a shift from ontological evil, a very strong shift from evil as somehow resulting from a flaw in the structure of reality to moral evil, right? The full emphasis goes to moral evil in the choices and actions of human beings. And that, of course, then will be combined with the defense of genuine human freedom in the subtreatise on fate, in a polemic against the Stoics and more determinist positions. But, George Boyce Stones and I, in my earlier publications, have pointed out that even in the treatise on fate, he wants to stick with the Stoics as far as he can. So he wants fate to be all-encompassing still, right? And so how does he arrive at the notion of an all-encompassing fate and maintain human freedom? Well, he does it through a form of hypothetical necessity, which doesn't get explained. So it goes, the hypothetical necessity goes as follows. A number of you might be familiar with these types of arguments. If Laius fathers a son, then he will be killed. But of course, it's up to Laius whether or not to father a son. Again, does this get us out of the bind of determinism? I'm not sure, but that's a different issue. And a small point related to that, again, a major point of departure, because Numenius has been seen as another sort of person shaping the commentary. I mean, heaven forbid that Calcidius in his own right, whoever he is, would have had, his own voice to develop. Unlike what he presents as Numenius, Calcidius does not think that the stars, even though they are corporeal, are negatively affected by matter at all, right? So you can compare what he says about Numenius in chapter 298 with what he says in chapter 174, his own position in the treatise on fate. So Numenius' idea, Numenius between quotation marks, is that given that the stars are corporeal, given that they contain matter, even the stars must be however minimally, affected by the challenges that come from matter and the evil world soul. And that's a view that Calcidius completely rejects, because for him the stars are perfect divine beings. So they're whatever. I mean, is Aristotle's fifth element in the background? Maybe, but he doesn't mention it. He simply says that for him, the kind of whatever the stars are, they are not affected by evil at all. They're perfect divine beings. All right, so what I've tried to do here is, through a close reading of those two chapters, actually give you a view of where Calcidius ends up on matter and evil. And I've also tried to pick out some of the broader implications for the commentary, for how the commentary is supposed to go, but also for the kind of Platonism that I think Calcidius represents. Thank you.